what is going to be the impact of the changing dynamics between Washington and Beijing? Let's try and weigh in on that. And for that, I'm joined in by Professor Robert E. Kelly. He's joining us live from Busan. He's a professor at the Busan University. Many thanks to you, Professor Kelly, for joining in on World 360. Do you think that this understanding that has been arrived upon between Washington and Beijing is going to reflect strategically also at some point between the United States and China? Because for the longest time for Donald Trump, China was seen as a major threat to the security of the Indo-Pacific. Their defense minister has said that they do hope to have US and China work together militarily as well.
No, I'm actually rather pessimistic on that myself. I think one of the noticeable things about the meeting was how little strategic issues were on the table. There was no discussion of nuclear weapons, no discussion of North Korea, no discussion of Taiwan. I mean, there are a lot of strategic issues out here in the East, in East Asia. I'm in South Korea, right? Chinese and, Chinese sort of U.S. cooperation on a lot of the stuff, say like North Korea's nuclear weapons program, would help a great deal, right? I mean, if the U.S. and China actually cooperated on stuff like climate change, we could probably make a lot of progress. But there just wasn't much there, right? I mean, the entire thing was dominated by trade. And a lot of that, I think, is just Donald Trump and the decisions he's made in the last 8 months. I mean, it's really clear that Donald Trump really believes in tariffs. Right? Not many people believe in tariffs anymore, right? I mean, it's really rare to find economists who think that tariffs are a good idea, but Trump is deeply committed to tariffs. And that, of course, has sort of introduced all this trade turbulence on top of all these other strategic issues. And so I think that really just kind of took over the meeting. And there's no mention, for example, in any of the reporting I saw about Taiwan, which is the biggest strategic issue of all, right? I mean, if the US and China actually fight over Taiwan, there's a possibility it could escalate into like a nuclear exchange. And so, I mean, I'm hoping at some point that these issues get discussed, because Trump and Xi are kind of tap dancing around these really, really large strategic issues. I mean, it's good that the trade stuff gets fixed,
right,
but, I mean, the bigger issues are, things like Ukraine, Taiwan, North Korea, and that just, apparently, we're still waiting. Apparently, none of that was discussed.
Professor Kelly, it's interesting you mentioned the absence of Taiwan in the talks. But remember, Trump has always made it amply clear since he arrived in the White House for a second time that Taiwan is not going to be his headache, right?
Yeah, I think Donald Trump is far less committed to Taiwan than Joe Biden. I think that Donald Trump doesn't feel, generally speaking, a commitment to the liberal community of states. That is to say that, Donald Trump doesn't make distinguishments between, say, Europe and the Russians, right? I mean, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump likes Vladimir Putin a lot, even though he's an autocrat. And I think in East Asia that applies too, that, Trump thinks that Kim Jong-un of North Korea is his friend just as much as the president of South Korea. And so because Trump doesn't really have this sort of preference for liberal states, I think there's a much greater chance the United States would abandon Taiwan if there was a conflict.
Okay.
And that would be a really big break with U.S. foreign policy, right?
Traditionally, let me come to the India angle, Professor. How does the Trump-Xi meet and other changes that are currently taking place affect the Indian economy, in your view, given that India still doesn't have that key bargaining chip like China does, which is, of course, the rare earth minerals? For us, the purchase of the U.S. farm products is still a roadblock, apart from the switch in Donald Trump's tone and tenor with regards to Pakistan and what happened post India's Operation Sindoor between both the countries.
Yeah, the more, just sort of transactionally, the more the U.S. and China get along, I suppose, the tougher it is for India, because now if there's a rapprochement between the two of them, India has less room to sort of play the two of them against each other, right? And we've seen that somewhat in the Ukraine war, where India's kind of tried to draw a neutral position and sort of talk to all sides and stuff like that, right? And so that's sort of geopolitically wise for India, but it sort of created some tension with Washington, and that's been heavily covered in your country. I think in the long term, I think it's kind of troublesome. If I were Indian, I think in the long term, it's kind of troublesome, because I think China is a much greater strategic threat to India than the United States is. My sense is, if I were an Indian, I would suggest that India kind of tilt towards the United States a little bit, because China is right on its border, and there's been sort of border conflicts in the past. And so to the extent that the US and the Chinese are getting along, I think that's a bit of a strategic issue for India. And I would imagine that if you get a real rapprochement, I don't know if Trump can do that, but if there is, I would imagine that, the Prime Minister Modi would be very interested in going and talking to the Americans again, because to the extent that China and the United States get together, it sort of locks India out of the strategic discussion in Asia, and that wouldn't be advantageous for India.
Professor Kelly, lastly, how do you see the trade tensions between India and the United States now shaping up, given there's going to be no meeting between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi, at least this year, since Modi made that virtual visit to ASEAN?
So my sense is that a lot of the U.S. tension towards India at the moment is driven by Donald Trump himself personally, right? There's actually sort of in the U.S. foreign policy community, sort of the environment that I move in, I would say that we're actually pretty pro-India, which is to say that India is a liberal democracy, the United States is a liberal democracy. A lot of people who do what I do really want India and the United States to be partners, maybe not allies. India doesn't want that, but at least partners to deal with illiberal states in Asia, primarily China. I think there's a lot of sympathy out there in the U.S. military, the U.S. national security community, the State Department for a thick Indo-U.S. relationship. And my sense is that there's a community for that in India too. I mean, you could speak to that better than me. But really, I mean, Trump is very mercurial, right? Trump is he's a very unique president. He's a real outlier compared to previous American presidents. He's not like Joseph Biden, who's more traditionalist. And I think a lot of the trade tension is really driven specifically by Donald Trump, particularly because of the perception that Trump has that India kind of like is helping Russia in the war and therefore kept Trump from a Nobel Prize.
All right.
I really do believe that a lot of it is driven by Trump's own personal picadillos and stuff like that. And so the bad news is that the relationship is kind of subject to Trump's moods. The good news is that Trump's moods change, and I think the strategic fundamentals of the relationship are still pretty strong. So if this kind of fades out of Trump's attention, I think the relationship will probably return. Broadly speaking, I think the long term for the U.S.-Indian relationship is pretty solid because of shared concerns about China.
Thank you for describing those whims and fancies of the US president and how much rests in this world on those whims and fancies. Many thanks to you, Professor Kelly. It was a pleasure having you here on World 360.